whenever this last weather change blew in, it's got my allergies. So when I start coughing, trust me, I'm not sick. I'm drowning in mucus. Occasionally you gotta cough to clear your throat. I think this is where we stopped. We had talked about Jackson and his desire, his willingness to take Florida. And John Quincy Adams was really his only ally in the cabinet and in Washington. And John Quincy Adams had been negotiating with Spain for the purchase of Florida. And what Jackson did made his position even stronger, because now it was pretty obvious to Spain, to the United States, and to the world that Spain had no control in Florida. And if we wanted it, we could just take it. So Adams aimed a little bit higher and negotiated the Transcontinental Treaty of 1919. It's also called the Adams-Onis Treaty, O-N-I-S. Adams wanted to see the United States stretch clear across the continent, ocean to ocean, what transcontinental means. And in the treaty, what he ended up getting, he did give in on Texas. He wanted Texas, but he didn't get Texas. He gets a line all the way across the country. Spain cedes all of Florida. The U.S. agrees to pay claims of U.S. citizens against Spain, people who had sued the Spanish for not upholding Pinckney's treaty, or for other grievances. And the western boundary of Louisiana Territory gets established. And it's this weird zigzag line up the Sabine to the Red River. It comes up, and it goes over, and then across. So we have a line all the way across the country. We now have a continent. We now can say that we have the full continent. Not everything. We don't own all of it, but we do have a line across. By 1845, it's going to take a while, but Florida will become a state. And that's kind of the end of the good feelings and the good things that were happening in this early part. I need that back. It's hard to think through mucus too. Sorry, maybe a little, not off, but kind of off. And that's going to drive me nuts. You can't. All right, you either get the title or you get the whole slide. So we're going to go for, yeah, you get it. You get it all there. And the reason that this good feeling came to an end is that there was a panic, an economic downturn. Basically, cotton prices tanked. Cotton in 1818 had been selling at 32.5 cents a pound, which was really high. Most of it was going to the cotton mills, to the cloth manufacturers in Britain. And about this time, the British realized that India is producing cotton. India is one of their colonies. India was supplying cotton cheaper. And they quit buying U.S. cotton. By by 1819, keep saying 19, sorry, cotton was selling at 14.3 cents a pound, less than half what it had been selling the year before. And along with the cotton decline, there's a decline in other U.S. goods. And it had a snowball effect. So speculators in the Western lands and Western land sales dropped because a lot of that had been people investing in land to grow cotton, but now cotton isn't worth growing, or it's not as worth growing. On top of that, you have the action of the state banks that we talked about earlier, where they would give loans without being able to back them. And they would give loans to people who couldn't pay them back. And then on top of that, you have embezzlement at the National Bank, at the branch in Baltimore. The bank had built several new branches. And it was found that a bank executive in Baltimore was embezzling at a high rate, which was almost just more embarrassing than anything else. But it kind of caps off all of this other economic woes. And that in itself sets off another string of events that don't worsen the panic, but kind of. A new bank president is named, Landon Chives. He lowers salaries for everybody, postpones payments of dividends to stockholders, restrains credit, so quits giving out easy loans, and he calls in state notes. Calling in the state notes put pressure on the state banks that didn't have the reserves to back their notes, that then put pressure on the people they've loaned money to pay their loans back, so they have money to pay the bank back. And it's kind of a vicious cycle. Cheves saves the banks, but it puts a bad taste in the mouth of particularly Western landowners who had gotten pressured to pay back their loans during an economic crisis. And you have a whole new enemy for the National Bank now in the Western landowners. When he's done, a new director is named, Nicholas Biddle. Biddle is going to run the bank successfully for a while, but this bad taste is in the South and the West is going to hang on, and it's going to come back to bite them. And then we have the slave issue rising up. This has always kind of been on a back burner, but during this time period and up to the Civil War, it's just going to start building and building and building. We've talked about it a little bit from the Revolutionary on. It's just part of our history, and it's part of the crisis of the 1820s. In 1819, there were 11 free states and 11 slave states. That means in the Senate, you have an equal number of representatives from slave states to free states. So anything that affected slavery could effectively be blocked in the Senate. Or, you're going to have a split vote. The House is different because bigger states have more representatives, but in the Senate, you have an even number. And in 1819, Missouri wants to join as a state. Missouri has been a territory, and they've gotten their 60,000 people, and they want to become a state. The Missouri Territory is a big chunk of the Louisiana Purchase. Does not include Louisiana. I think at this point it still does include Arkansas, but it's going to get cut down to the size we know it now. It has a booming economy. People have lived there for a while. St. Louis has become the funnel for settlers moving west. Most of these are Southerners. And nothing official has been done in the Louisiana Territory concerning slavery. Slavery had existed there under the French. It had existed there under the Spanish. Nothing has been settled. And so Missouri wants to come in. James Talbridge of New York proposes a resolution that would allow Missouri to become a state, but would prohibit the transportation of any more slaves into Missouri. There's already about 10,000 there, and provide for freedom at 25 to the slaves born there after statehood. Now he's from New York. It passes on a sectional vote in the House, but because the Senate is even, it's rejected in the Senate. At the same time, Maine is applying for statehood. Maine is way up here. I was looking at a map the other day, and Maine is one of the places that doesn't have COVID right now, or at least not a sizable amount. It would be one of the good places to go live. Now, if you can get Maine and Missouri to both enter at the same time, you're going to keep the balance in the Senate. And maintaining the status quo was what everybody was looking at right now. But I have to figure out exactly how we're going to do this. So the Senate proposes to allow both states to come in. Maine is a free state, Missouri is a slave state, and further, they offer a compromise. This is the Great Missouri Compromise. Maine and Missouri come in as states. Slavery is excluded. And this one has always bothered me. It's excluded north of 3630, which is Missouri's southern boundary. So from here up, except for Missouri, because Missouri is allowed to come in as a slave state, you're not going to have slavery in the territories. I don't know why they didn't go with the northern boundary. It seems to me very odd. It always has bothered me that they went with the southern boundary and it's like, nothing north of this line except for this state. You can have slaves. It's going to kind of allow for Arkansas and Mississippi to come in as slave states later. It's kind of unspoken. And it passes the House on March 2nd, 1820. And politicians thought, okay, great. We've avoided the subject one more time, except Missouri wrote into their state constitution a provision excluding free blacks and mulattoes from the state, which is a clear violation of Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution, which says, the citizens of each state shall be entitled to all the privileges and immunities of the citizens of all the states. So you had to have a second compromise, which was really somewhat lame. Henry Clay is the one that organized the second compromise, which basically said It was an assurance that the Missouri legislature promised not to construe the offending clause in such a way that it sanctioned the denial of privileges of citizens. So basically, the Missouri legislature promised to never apply their constitution. They didn't take it out. They just said, oh, well, we just won't, we'll pretend that we didn't say that, which is, but that is how touchy this whole situation becomes. It's a political landmine to talk about slavery. On August 10th, 1821, Missouri becomes the 24th state. I can't remember if Maine was the 23rd or the 25th. It had to have been the 23rd because you got to stay even. So Maine came in as the 23rd, Missouri comes in as the 24th, and you still have a balance in Congress. Now, this situation, this one compromise does not get as ugly as some of them are going to be. It was certainly heated, but there aren't great threats of secession yet. We're going to get to that. But you're starting to see an end, or you're seeing an end to this happy, oh, we're a peaceful, wonderful country, and all is well with the world, because it's not. Okay, so the next issue that Monroe is going to have to deal with is with the Supreme Court. We've talked about John Marshall. John Marshall is still the head of the Supreme Court. He's the Chief Justice, and he is still continuing this Hamiltonian federalism. And we're going to add a few more precedents during this time period. We talked about Mayberry versus Madison already. I'm not going to go back over that. That was the principle of judicial review. Mayberry and Madison was judicial review of federal laws. There's another law that passes, Fletcher versus Peck, in which Marshall establishes that not only can the Supreme Court review federal laws, it can review state laws. This isn't written into the Constitution, but the precedents are being set. And he does this based on the rights, the next two are kind of this too. It's the right to consider appeals of state courts on the grounds that the Constitution, the laws and treaties of the United States should be kept uniformly supreme, or could be kept uniformly supreme only if the court could review the decisions of the state. And he establishes this in Martin versus Hunter Lacey, which was tried in 1816 and dealt with some Loyalist property that had been sold after the Revolution. And Cohen's versus Virginia, which had to do with whether or not Virginia could actually sell lottery tickets. He established the review of contract rights in Dartmouth College versus Woodward. That was actually pretty interesting. Dartmouth College had been established during the colonial days, and it had a self-perpetuating board, which was independent of any governing body. They ran the college, and that was just it. The contract that set up Dartmouth College predates the Constitution. Now, New Hampshire didn't like, the New Hampshire legislature didn't like the Dartmouth board. They didn't fall into the politics that the New Hampshire legislature wanted them to. And they attempted to alter the Dartmouth Charter to get rid of the self-perpetuating board. Marshall rules that you can't do that. You can't change a contract after it has been established. That there was a valid contract and the legislature cannot impair that. That is an act forbidden by the Constitution. So the Dartmouth Board got to keep its self-perpetuating nature. And I want to say it was too liberal for the New Hampshire legislature, but they got to keep on running the college the way they wished. After this, most contracts, particularly with state governments, are going to have a clause in them that allows making them subject to modification. But this decision implies a new and expanded definition of the idea of a contract. And there's two more. Second to last case we're going to look at is McCulloch versus Maryland. And this is a case that strengthens the power of the federal government. Remember, Marshall is a Hamiltonian. He believes in a strong central federal government. So the case involves James McCulloch, who was a clerk at the Baltimore branch of the Bank of the United States. Yeah, the one that had embezzlement issues. Maryland charges him on failing to affix state revenue banks on banknotes as required by Maryland law. Marshall argues that Maryland had no right to tax the government. If it wanted to affix stamp taxes to its own state goods, that was fine, but it had no right to tax the federal government. And his argument is that the federal government that rather than the federal government being a creature of the sovereign states, it was a creature of the people. That the power of the federal government didn't come from the states, that it came from the people. And that the states also got power from the people, but their power was separate. And that the power of the federal government was a step above the power of the states. So therefore, states could not take it. What he said was sovereignty was divided between the states and the national government. And he quotes from the Constitution, limited in its power, is supreme within its sphere of action. So where the states had power, they had supreme power. But where they had to share, they had to defer to the government. Okay, and the last was interstate commerce. It is clear that the Constitution allows the federal government to regulate interstate commerce. We've used this before. And the case is Gibbons versus Ogden, and it's tried in 1824. And this also strengthens the national government because it establishes the precedent of national supremacy in regulating trade. So what this case is about is steamboats. In 1808, Robert Fulton and Robert Livingston established the commercial use of steamboats. And they were given a monopoly by New York on the state's rivers and lakes. They in turn gave a man, Aaron Ogden, the Hudson River between New York and New Jersey. Now this is important. It goes from New York to New Jersey. It's not just within New York State. Another man, Thomas Gibbons operated ships under a federal license as a competitor. Ogden claims he has a monopoly because Livingston and Fulton have a monopoly, but they have a monopoly within New York State. They do not have a monopoly on interstate trade. So as long as what he is doing is interstate trade, Marshall ruled that the state monopoly conflicted with the Federal Coasting Act. It stopped short of giving exclusive federal power. States had jurisdiction as long as it didn't conflict. And this case is going to open the way for extensive development of steamboat navigation and railroads, because it clearly says if you're going from one state to another, what you need is federal approval, not state approval. So you get a lot of precedents set in this time period that are going to play out long after that one little court case is fought. And I know this seems like we're kind of jumping around, but there's lots of little things. And let's go back to diplomacy. We've talked about the British, we talked about Spain, and we made those agreements. Now we have some issues in the Northwest, which seems very, very far from anything that they've settled so far. But Lewis and Clark went all the way up there. And we have a claim. But other people are starting to lay claim too. Russia is going to claim the Pacific coast as far as the 51st parallel. They do this in 1821. We really don't want anybody else playing on our continent. We've kind of, got the British pushed above here. This is the 50th parallel, so I'm not exactly sure where 51st goes, but they're making claims down the coast, and we don't want them to get any closer. Yeah, it's a little bit above. I just don't, it has lines that are in tens, so I don't know exactly where you would draw the 51st. We want them higher than that. We're looking at 5440. In fact, the slogan is going to be 5440 or fight. And in 1823, Secretary of State Adams contests the right of Russia to any development on the continent. We're going to settle a treaty in 1824 that settles the boundary at 5440. And now we're settling the boundary for an area that we share with Britain, because we agreed to share the Oregon Territory with Britain indefinitely. So Britain and Russia also come to a similar treaty at 5440. And then in 1827, the US and Great Britain further solidified that agreement for joint occupation. But this idea that Europeans might want to come into our continent is something that's raising concern with Monroe, raising concern with Adams, and they decide to deal with it kind of the best they can. And they come up with the Monroe Document. In 1823, there are rumors that France wants to restore Spain to power over its old American empire, which, yes, its old American empire was mostly in South America, But there was Mexico and there was Texas. And we're kind of eyeing South America, and we trade with South America. So we really don't want the Spanish back in. We don't want the French in. Britain suggests a joint statement of opposition. Adams says, maybe not. Because as part of this joint statement of occupation, or joint statement of opposition, they also want the United States to agree not to acquire any more Spanish territory, which at this point is Cuba, Texas, and California. Texas and California, we are definitely eyeing. Cuba wouldn't be bad, but maybe not. We don't want to agree that we don't want them. And Adams doesn't want to come off as riding in on the British coattails. Adams was actually pretty good at diplomatic maneuvering. So he suggests that instead of acting with the British, we need to state our principles up front. And Monroe does this in his annual message to Congress, and he states, it's kind of 4 parts. 1, that, quote, the American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European power. The second point was that the political systems of Europe were different from the United States, and the United States would, quote, consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. The third part was that the United States would not interfere with any existing European colony. And the last was that the United States would keep out of the internal affairs and wars of European powers. This is the Monroe document or doctrine. It's not going to be known as that until 1852. We still look like we come riding in on the coattails of the British because they do make a statement of opposition, and they have the means to enforce it, and we really don't. But it's out there. It's just kind of hanging in the wind, waiting to be used, waiting to be necessary. And we get time, it's coming time for another election. But as I noted before, the 2 parties, the Federalists and the Republicans, have pretty much gone by the wayside. In Monroe's last election, they just let him keep it, basically. There was no opposition. Monroe was doing fine. But now we have another election, and it's going to get ugly. And the players are going to be Secretary of State John Calhoun, Secretary of Treasury William H. Crawford. Crawford was probably the logical choice. He would have been the next in the Virginia dynasty line. He was from Virginia. He was an old Republican, heavy into states' rights. Then you have Secretary of State John Quincy Adams from Massachusetts, and Speaker of the House Henry Clay. And then out of the left comes Andrew Jackson, throwing his hat in the ring. And Jackson didn't actively seek out the nomination. Someone else threw his name in the hat, but and I didn't write the quote down, but something to the effect of political office should not be sought, but if offered, should not be declined. Andrew Jackson is very popular. A lot of people liked what he did in Florida. A lot of people liked what he did in New Orleans. And he adds a whole new twist on this. The Congressional Congress, which had been a tradition, disappeared with Monroe in the last election. Like I said, Crawford was the natural successor to the Virginia dynasty. Clay was riding on the tails of the American system. Jackson was very vague. Jackson will stay very vague in all of his elections, which politically is sometimes a good thing. If you don't have a stand, nobody can dislike your stand. And Jackson was just riding on the "I'm a very popular general" train. Calhoun kind of backs off. He's offered the vice presidency under either Jackson or Adams. And Adams is running on a platform much like Clay's, with a federalist bent. And when all the numbers come down, there's no clear winner. Adams carries New England and most of New York. Clay takes Kentucky, Ohio, and Missouri, some of New York. Crawford carries Virginia, Georgia, and Delaware. Jackson takes the rest of the South. But none of them have enough numbers to actually win. So it gets thrown into the House, where Henry Clay is the Speaker. And while he pretty much lost, he had the least amount of votes, which says something about what people thought of his American system. He is now in a very powerful position. He gets, as Speaker of the House, he has a lot of influence. He doesn't like Jackson. What he says about him, I cannot believe that killing 2,500 Englishmen at New Orleans qualifies for the various difficult and complicated duties of the chief magistrate. He just didn't think Jackson was qualified. And they're very much alike. They're both very bullheaded, argumentative, high temper men that aren't going to get along. Clay puts his support behind John Quincy Adams. Adams probably was not aware of the backroom dealings. That was not Adams' style. But he becomes president and is immediately crippled because Clay's backroom dealings unite Adams' foes against him. And he is accused of participating in a corrupt bargain, even though he probably didn't have a lot to do with it. But this is also going to signal the rise of new political parties as people unite either for or against Adams. The Adams and Clay group are going to, basically they're going to be economic nationalists, pushing that American system, and they call themselves National Republicans. And the rest follow Jackson and call themselves Democratic Republicans. Adams was an able but ineffective president. He lacked the common touch. He was very much like his father. He didn't believe in backroom dealings. He was sort of a monarchist. He didn't trust the common people. And he lacked that politician's gift for compromise. One thing that I find admirable, but did not help him much as president, is he didn't believe in patronage. Patronage is how politicians stay in business. He didn't think, and like I said, I think this is admirable. He didn't see the point in firing a perfectly good civil employee just because they were on the wrong side of the politics. Just because you were a Democrat and he was Federalist did not mean they needed to fire you. You know, if you were a good postal worker, then fine, just keep doing your job. But that doesn't help you as a politician. He had bold plans, and he was accused of being a monarchist, and nothing really comes out in the next 4 years. The next election will be an election between Andrew Jackson and Adams. It's going to be an election of mudslinging rather than an election of issues. Because like I said, and Jackson isn't going to pick an issue and stand by it. Jackson had the advantage. He was a hero. He has the advantage because he was vague. And Jackson will win the election in 1828. And we are going to stop here because we're out of slides. And because I want to start the Jacksonian impulse separately. Now, we are going to have a test over this section, but not today. I'm going to wait until we get done with the Jacksonian part, and then we'll combine both of these sections together to have the test. Okay? All right. I know we're ending early, but I can't breathe. So we're going to end now. So don't worry about a test today.